Hey film fans, today I want to talk about how camera decisions, specifically framing, movement, and focus, can affect the tone or the feel of a scene. In this case, a quite frightening scene. It's a scene from a horror film. It's not a horror scene, it's a scene early in the film, but it lends a lot of weight to the atmosphere that the film develops as its horror it encroaches on the narrative. I'm talking about the 2008 sort of European art house horror breakout smash, Let the Right One In. And what I want to look at is the first appearance of the Bullies in this episode of Break the Scene. Let the Right One In is a slow-moving Swedish horror film. It was directed by Tomas Alfredson, and the script was written by Jonsäter Lindqvist. Pardon my Swedish pronunciation. Jonsäter Lindqvist, based on his novel, and the two of them worked together quite closely on developing the script from the novel. And it features stunning cinematography, and I'm going to butcher this name, but by Hoytema. And he has become quite a big deal on the sort of thinking person's blockbuster scene. So he shot last year's Ad Astra, and he's shot several of Christopher Nolan's most recent films. Here, working with a much smaller budget, but you can see clearly what it is about the camera work in this film that would have appealed to somebody like Christopher Nolan to think, like, I want this guy shooting my films. It's a film that they made thinking it might do well in Sweden, and it became a kind of international art house hit. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It is a horror film. There's a little bit of gore. A lot of it is sort of scaring you by what you don't see, but there is some gore and some blood throughout the film. But mostly it's a real slow burning, tense horror drama about two children who make an unlikely friendship. And I'm not going to say too much about the actual horror of the film or what it's about. It's fun to discover that on your own. But the horror starts building almost from the beginning of the film. And that has a lot to do with the cinematography, also the production design, the fact that it's set in winter, it's set in the early 80s in this sort of working class housing estate in Sweden. There's a lot of alcoholism. People are on the border of poverty. It's dark a lot because it's winter in Sweden. You see people's breaths. So there's this enclosed feeling about the entire film. People want to be inside. The production design includes a lot of sort of squares and boxes, and we see a lot of shots of people in rooms with somebody else in the room next door, and they're separated by walls. So the entire design of the film has a sense of the characters being closed in, and that's a very important part of the tone of the film as it develops and as its horror conditions, where its horror tropes unfold. The scene I want to look at comes really early in the film, and it concerns the protagonist, Oscar. Oscar's a young boy, around 12 years old, and he's played by Kåre Hedebrant. And what most of the film is about is his kind of strange, unsettling relationship or friendship, or let's say burgeoning friendship, with Elif, who's played by Lina Leandersson. And this is the first role for both of these actors. And their developing friendship and how it's complicated by the horror apparatus of the film is what it's mostly about. But before we meet Elif, we meet Oscar. And Oscar is frail. In fact, the first time we see him, he's in his underpants, and he's very pale. He's got this like stark blonde hair, and we see him against the window, and it's very cold outside, and it just creates this picture of vulnerability of Oscar. And that's compounded by a subplot that runs throughout the film and is very important to the film, that Oscar's bullied at school. And so I want to watch the first scene where the bullies appear, but just a little bit of setup. And the scene immediately preceding it, and this is very early in the film, we're talking 5 or 6 minutes in, Oscar's in school. We haven't met the bullies yet. And there's a police officer there who's talking about safety, he's talking about drugs, different things, and he asks a question, and Oscar answers it. And you see some of the kids in the class turn and look at him. And what you're sort of paying attention to is Oscar in his interaction with the police officer. There's some joking going on, but your eye might be drawn to the presence of first these two boys, then as the camera pans over to the right, a third boy. And part of what draws your attention to them is the shallow focus in the rest of the room. And that's going to come back into the scene we're going to look at. But the point is, Oscar just, does what a pupil should do. He gives an answer to a question, and you see in these boys' eyes something. Threat, resentment, they want to make fun of him. And then we cut immediately to the scene in question.
Vad duktig du var, grisen.
You feel the menace, right? It's a very short scene. It's only about 30 seconds, but it's laden with kind of menacing tension. So let's just break it down. The first thing to notice is that there's this little sound bridge, a little sort of J-cut, that connects the end of the classroom scene with this hallway scene. Right? So there's a nice little, pretty common sort of sound bridge that takes place there. And then we cut to this hallway. And what do we see? We see two presumably boys, but they might be girls, kind of wrestling or grappling with each other on a bench, but we don't see their heads. And I think that's a conscious choice on the part of the filmmakers to sort of not necessarily decapitate. It's not that kind of movie. Well, in parts it is. But to depersonalize these children in the hallway. And that's an important part of the feeling or the menace of the scene, so that we cut to these two children fighting with no facial expressions, no head, no hair, no personality is quite important. And then immediately we hear someone yell our protagonist's name. Now, if you look on screen, Oscar's not there. Is he one of those two boys? Is he going to step down and say, what? No. But we don't see him. We don't know. We also don't see the person yelling out his name. But the camera begins to move. This is a really wonderfully designed shot because the camera's moving so slowly that you almost don't notice what's happening, but the camera is tracking right. Oscar comes into the frame to the left. He's not moving from left to right, he's moving backwards. And we don't see whatever it is he's looking at. That, whatever it is off screen, presumably the person who's saying his name. But what that creates is a tension or a threat. Whenever we see somebody backing away from something, especially slowly like that, we presume that the thing that they're backing away from is a potential threat. So we get this situation here. So as the camera's moving to the right, Oscar's mimicking its movement in terms of direction to our eyes, but he's actually moving backwards into the frame. And that's a very important point because he's afraid. The camera does three things next that are really important to the effectiveness of the scene. First, as he backs away from whatever's off screen, he moves faster than the camera. So Oscar backs into center frame and then over to the right. Well, this is my right. Over to the right of frame for you. So he's moving across the frame, and yet still, whatever it is that he's backing away from, we don't see. So this intensifies the threat because now we have anticipation. What is this? Now, if you've paid close attention to the previous scene in the classroom, you might have a pretty good idea. But just the fact of not showing it to us yet intensifies that sort of anticipation. The next thing that it does is it moves to the right as Oscar's backing up, but it's also moving closer to him. So he's becoming bigger in the frame. He's getting closer. This serves to make the scene more intimate because we're going to get into a close-up on Oscar's face and eventually the other face. And that's very important too because of the space that the camera is going to invite us, the viewer, to take part in. And the third thing that happens that's really important here is that there's a very subtle but important rack focus going on. And rack focus is a device that filmmakers use when they change the focus during a shot. Now, it's often used, as it is in this film, when there are two or more characters in a scene and they're at different focal lengths from the camera. And you can't have them both in focus unless you use a split diopter or something like that. So one of them's in focus, let's say the one closest to the camera, and another one's out of focus, let's say the one furthest from the camera. And then for some reason, the director, the cinematographer, the focus puller decide that this person needs to be in focus, usually because they're going to start talking. And there's a rack focus, so the focus is changed in the shot. Here's a quick example from this film. So that's typical of what I'm talking about. His mother's talking, she's in focus, he's in the other room with the mirror. There's all kinds of great stuff in this film with mirrors. And then when he responds, there's a rack focus, and now he's in focus. In this scene with the bullies, it's a lot subtler because the focus of the focus, the objects in the background are not as important to us, so we might not notice that slowly the children in the background are going out of focus. The focus is becoming increasingly shallow, right? So deep focus in a film is when you can see far into the background and everything's clear. Shallow focus is when anything beyond the protagonist is out of focus or blurry. And so that's slowly happening in this scene. So just these three things are: Oscar moves through the frame, the camera pushes closer to him, and everything beyond him becomes blurry. Then, finally, we're in close-up on Oscar. He takes up about a third of the screen, right? And he backs up against those lockers. He's got nowhere to go. He's stuck. The camera's on him here, the lockers are behind his back, and in walks the bully. And Oscar's cornered. And then what we see here, which is really fascinating and a really important part of the tension, I think, is the way the focus subtly changes in this scene. Notice how as the bully moves in, he kind of invades Oscar's space. There's another rack focus there, and Oscar himself actually goes out of focus slightly. He's so close to the camera, and the two of them are so close to each other, that he's not completely out of focus. But his features are blurred, and the attention is on the bully. And he's invaded Oscar's physical space, he's invaded the space of the frame, and he's gonna invade his actual bodily space with that little flick on the nose and the way he calls Oscar Piggy. And he's got this look of disdain, maybe even hatred on his face while Oscar's there frozen. Look at his eyes, look at the way he's looking down. He can't look the bully in the eye. He's back up against the lockers. This is a very claustrophobic feeling. And if you notice, even as Oscar's out of focus, between the bully and the camera, everything behind the bully is also out of focus. And the important thing about that is we are tight in this world. The frame has pulled us in, and the shallow depth of field has pulled us in so that nothing else matters except what's going on right here. But also, nobody else cares. They might as well all have their heads chopped off. Nobody cares that this is going on. And Oscar's living in this moment of terror, and there's nothing he can do about it, and there's nothing that anyone else in the school is willing to do about it. Then, just so perfectly timed, I mean, this focus puller should have won an award for this. As the bully walks away with the other two, and we'll find out that all three of those boys who were looking at him in the classroom are part of a gang that's terrorizing him. As they walk away, there's another rack focus in on Oscar as he sits there and just sits in his fear. The movie's gonna get a lot more horrific than this. And the bullies are gonna play a role in that throughout the film, all the way up to its climax, really. And so this scene, as sort of short as it is, and kind of minor as it is in a way, is setting up several key plot and character developments that are gonna go throughout the film all the way up till its climax. And one of the things I love about it is how these seemingly kind of minor camera decisions, framing, focus, and movement, take a scene that could have been your sort of typical school bully scene, which we've seen millions of in cinema, and turns it into this moment of pure claustrophobic terror. And it's setting up a tone and a theme that's going to slowly build and develop throughout the rest of the film. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't seen Let the Right One In, I highly recommend it. If you've seen the American version, which I think is called Let Me In, and you think that's enough, it's not. That film has some good performances. It also has some nice cinematography, but it's a pale comparison to the original, which is a beautiful, unnerving, thoughtful, and beautifully, delicately made film. I highly recommend it. You should really watch that film. Until next time, my name's Aaron Hunter. I would love if you'd share this video, hit the like button, and if this isn't your first video, if you're here for second, third, fifth, 10th, 12th, whatever time, hit the subscribe button. My teaching semester's over. I'm going to be putting up more videos over the holidays, so if this is the kind of content you like, which some of you have told me it is, hit the subscribe. Ask a friend to subscribe. Whatever, just come back and keep watching the videos. And I'll see you in the next one. Until next time, keep watching movies.